I know I've been a broken record on the issues I think we need to tackle: water, education, affordability, housing. These are all really critical issues that we should be having full-day legislative hearings on, and we're not. Instead, we're having these circus shows.
Democratic Governor Katie Hobbs says someone needs to be held accountable for a Republican-run election hearing unlike any in recent memory. She's far from the only elected official who feels that way. Republican County Recorder Stephen Richer said he was considering a defamation lawsuit. So for a second straight week on the show, we're asking whether anyone will pay a price for conduct that, even by political standards, is way out of bounds. Joining us to talk about all that and more, Roy Herrera, former prosecutor, now Democratic election law lawyer at Herrera, Arellano in Phoenix, and Tyler Montague, Republican political activist. Welcome back.
Thank you so much.
So last week, we were talking about Mark Brnovich, former attorney general who concealed results of his own investigators' report showing they debunked a lot of election conspiracy theories. Brnovich now the subject of 18 bar charges at last count. Now we're talking about Republicans backing away from a witness at a Republican-only Elections Committee hearing. The witness, a Scottsdale insurance agent, spent 40 minutes going down a rabbit hole of election fraud fueled by mortgages, bribery, drug cartels, and elected officials. Democrat and Republican, it was bipartisan from Katie Hobbs on down. The hearing was a week ago Thursday. What stood out was the reaction from top Republican elected leaders to Liz Harris, Representative Liz Harris, who brought in this speaker. What'd you make of that reaction?
Well, it was so outrageous that I mean, when Wendy Rogers is pushing away from you saying, whoa, that's too extreme for me, you really went out of bounds. And so, what I make of it is that this may mark another milestone. You're never going to convince the conspiracy theorists to walk away, but this may mark an inflection point where normal Republicans finally distance themselves from this. These conspiracies are losing for the Republican Party. That's how Kerry Lake lost. That's how Fincham and others, Blake Masters, lost. It's time to move away from that.
And what I find interesting is just following the Republican Party, Arizona Republican Party, social media, Jeff DeWitt, the new party chairman, they haven't amplified any of this at all. They haven't touched election conspiracies since DeWitt took over. Is that a sign of what Tyler's talking about?
Well, I'd like to be as optimistic as Tyler and take this as maybe a turning point, that after years of election denial and false claims about election fraud, which culminated in this crazy conspiracy theory involving the Sinaloa drug cartel, bribing elected officials here in Arizona, that suddenly Republicans have seen the truth and they will move on from the big lie. But unfortunately, I actually think the real reason that they've distanced themselves to the extent that they've done that is because they don't want to be associated with the legal risk that may come from this. And what I'm talking about here ultimately is whether there's any defamation lawsuits that get filed.
And that's, we're talking about this today because the real news didn't happen until last Sunday night when Wendy Rogers, as you pointed out, the leading election denier, issued a statement sort of walking back from this. Was it the defamation threat, you think, that got to her?
I think so. And when I say walking back, I mean, really what I've seen here is that they just want to change the subject. It's not really acknowledging that anything wrong was said during this hearing. But I think ultimately, you know, myself, my firm, other law firms in town have been contacted by elected officials that have been named in this to explore legal options. I think defamation lawsuits could potentially happen at some point. Because what happened here, you know, was disparaging of the reputation of so many Republican and Democratic elected officials. It has resulted in threats to these electeds. Defamation of character potentially. So I think, you know, ultimately it comes back to that. They don't want to be associated with whatever might come down the pike.
And Ben Toma, the House Speaker, did use the word defamation in his statement on this, but these are public officials. And as a journalist, I know the law, you know the law. It's a very high bar to prove defamation against a public official. I'll admit, I thought to myself, if any case can do it, this might be it. But seriously, is that a real threat?
You know, it's more difficult for public officials because you have to show actual malice, so the standard is much, much higher. But leaving aside the defamation, I mean, if the Republican leadership was actually worried about this and were mad about this, they have options of their own in the legislature. There are things like removing committee chairmanships, removing them from the committees, censorship, which is obviously a procedure that Wendy Rogers already is familiar with. So if they wanted to do something here, they could, and ultimately that's what I want to see if there's going to be some punishment here.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Liz Harris, Representative Liz Harris, a long-time election denier, Chandler, first-term rep, Republican from Chandler. All the finger pointing was at her. She issued a statement kind of stepping back, but is she immune right now from the kind of thing Roy's talking about? Because she's a swing vote.
Well, yeah, and that's why they even tolerate it at all, is because they need her to govern. It's the unfortunate situation that they're in. But I think the defamation lawsuits ought to happen. She ought to be held account.
And you had another idea as well. That was
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
He's an innovator here.
I've got an innovative new idea. You know, the question I have is, at what point, every time they put out an email or make one of these statements, they have a little fundraising link. And they're raising money with lies. That at this point, the courts have adjudicated this stuff, and it's not true, yet you're making money off of it. At what point does that become fraud? I think it is from a real-world definition, but legally, at what point does that become fraud?
And, you know, by the time Wendy Rogers came out with her statement Sunday night, the video had been seen millions of times. Social media had hundreds of thousands of clicks
The damage
on
is
this
done.
conspiracy. This was really, really striking. Okay, got to pause.